Hello, everyone. I'm Sunil Amrit, the chair of the South Asian Studies Council. I just wanted to welcome you all to the first event in our full Colloquium series. While in some ways it is a shame that we can't all be together on campus, and particularly we miss the sense of community and the informal conversations that would usually happen around the Colloquium, we're delighted that the remote format allows many people to join us who aren't in New Haven, who aren't at Yale, and we welcome you all. I just want to very briefly advertise some of our upcoming events. Next Friday, October 2nd, we have our annual Gandhi lecture, which has been given this year by Professor Smriti Srinivas. I hope many of you will be able to join us there. And for the rest of the semester, we'll be doing regular live events on Zoom like this one, but also some pre-recorded conversations, which will go out as videos and as podcasts. And we're going to experiment as much as we can with the different ways in which we can continue to connect with people in these times. I can't imagine a more urgently timely topic on which to start than this wonderful panel that Sarah Khan has put together. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sunil. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sarah Khan, and I'm an assistant professor in the political science department here at Yale. And it's my great privilege to be able to convene this conversation on the question of building solidarity for racial justice in South Asian spaces, and to do so with this amazing group of organizers and scholar activists. I want to thank the South Asia Council, in particular the program director, Dr. Kasturi Gupta, and the council's student workers, Mehmet, Ram, and Ryan, for their support for this event. So just a note on format, I'll start by introducing my co-moderator and the panelists. And I've asked each of them to start off with just 4 to 5 minutes of introductory remarks about how their work and the work of their respective organizations has been informed and shaped by the mass mobilization that we've seen for racial justice and the work of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States over the past few months. After that set of introductory remarks, we'll move into a set of focused questions for the panel, and then we really hope to reserve the last half hour of this event for a discussion and Q&A with all of you who've joined us, and thank you again for doing so. So I want to start first with introducing Sasha Sabherwal, who is co-moderating this panel with me. Sasha is a Ph.D. student in the American Studies Department at Yale. Her work explores caste, gender, and religion in the Sikh diaspora of the Pacific Northwest. And this panel actually draws heavily on a new course that she's designed and is teaching as a joint offering with the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program and the South Asian Studies program here at Yale. Over to you, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I also want to echo the thanks to all the folks at the South Asian Studies Council, Kasturi, Ram, Ryan, and for making this possible and sort of having this really formative conversation. So the idea for this panel actually began with early conversations between Sarah and I discussing the possibility of cross-listing my new course, South Asians in America, with the South Asian Studies major at Yale. Fortunately, the seminar met the requirement of having 50% South Asian content. But as a scholar of diaspora, migration, and transnational feminism, I'm constantly questioning what constitutes South Asia and how to push against the cultural, political, and social borders of siloing regions in this way. In the South Asian in America seminar, I focus on the iterative and mutually constitutive relationship between the diaspora and the South Asian homeland, and trace how South Asians are grappling with questions of belonging, national affiliations, and what Iowa Ong calls flexible citizenship, or the emergence of new uses of citizenship by migrants in responses to the conditions of transnationalism. In the seminar, I also highlight issues that are not traditionally featured in South Asian diasporic syllabi, paying attention to anti-Blackness, caste, and political violence. The arc of the class historicizes South Asian migrations and theorizes racial formations in the United States. Each week, we take on different themes, from colonialism and empire to the racialization of religion and the global rise of Hindutva, to understanding the residues of anti-Asian exclusion in a post-9/11 world. Students, some of whom are in the audience today, are asked to think specifically about anti-Blackness in the South Asian community and how it is amplified through cultural practices and cultural appropriation. We also explore how caste and class manifest unevenly throughout the community across suburban and urban racial geographies in the US and in different labor contexts. The range of themes in the course allows students to think about the heterogeneity and complexity of the South Asian diaspora and to simultaneously understand diasporic complicities in racial, settler, and political violence. I'm excited to share this space with our panelists who are brilliant activists, organizers, archivists, and scholars in their own right, and I look forward to the conversations that reflect on the challenges and opportunities in organizing for racial justice in South Asian communities in the United States.
Thank you, Sasha. And I'm really excited that some of the students from Sasha's class are joining us, and I hope that we'll have a chance to hear their thoughts when we move into Q&A. So I want to start now by moving to our first panelist, Sharmin Hossain. Sharmin is a Bangladeshi-American Muslim organizer and artist from Queens, New York, and she's the political director at Equality Labs, an Ambedkarite South Asian progressive power-building organization that uses community research, cultural and political organizing, popular education, and digital security to fight the oppressions of caste apartheid, Islamophobia, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. A co-founder of the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective and graduate from CUNY Hunter College, Sharmin is committed to community-based arts, practice, leadership development, South Asian political history, and liberation struggles. Sharmin, welcome.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Sasha. I am really honored to be on this panel today. I have had the pleasure of working with so many folks who are both in audience and on the panel in many capacities. So although virtual organizing is difficult, I'm glad that we are all here and hopefully everyone is in good health. You know, I feel like Equality Labs' story is so many caste oppressed people's stories. It is the story of South Asian religious and cultural minorities who have always felt like India was the dominant narrative of what is South Asia. So I'm looking forward today to unpacking the layers, but also looking at the ways political positionalities, but also socioeconomic positions determine what types of struggles our people take on. Equality Labs started in 2015 officially, and our fight against caste apartheid, religious extremism, and gender-based violence was something that Dalit feminists were ringing the alarm on for many years. Many people are alarmed, rightly so, by the rise of Trump and the rise of Modi. But for many Dalit, Bahujan, and Muslim people, religious extremism, cow lynchings, violence for eating beef, has been the norm of their experience in India. So when Thenmozhi Soundararajan started this organization, we really wanted to center those stories and those experiences of those that are marginalized in our communities by caste, religion, and gender. Through our work, we have built a rich set of practices. So much of South Asian history is Brahmanical history. So much of what we understand South Asia to be is actually the story of dominant caste networks. So by centering those that are caste oppressed and minorities within South Asia, we have been able to do grassroots organizing, cultural organizing, artwork, as well as research that is based in the experiences of those that have been left out of history. Being an Ambedkarite means that we are abolitionist. And I think because of the moment that we're in, where the movement for Black lives is calling on all allies to really stand on the right side of history, but also not fight for reform, to actually fight for the abolition of systems that are oppressing us, really means that we as people that are caste oppressed, but also on the margins of our community, work through a philosophy of uplifting the liberatory vision of caste annihilation and social equity. Ambedkar, for many of us, provides a vision of centering caste-oppressed communities, and it's a central practice of equality labs. Our methods are shaped by the communities that we organized. One of the things that happens under the term of South Asia is that we get homogenized, but also caste becomes invisibilized. South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans constitute over 1 billion people in the world, but it also means that we have vastly different backgrounds, histories, and experiences. Our 2018 report, Caste in the United States, was a result of what happens when hegemony dominates the cultural organizing sphere, because in 2016, dominant caste networks tried to erase caste out of California textbooks. And that was one of the first times that we saw right-wing factions like the Hindu American Foundation and other right-wing networks organize to do cultural work that was erasing Dalit and caste-oppressed people from history. So we chose data-driven community research as our way to respond to this systemic disinformation. We believe that community-sourced research was a way of democratizing knowledge, but also making it accessible through popular education, which many of you have the opportunity to attend and engage with, but also understanding the systems and the challenges of what it is to organize against them. So in order to shape and redefine South Asian American identity, we recognize that it's not just about where we're from, it is not just about representation, and it's not just about trauma that our communities have survived. We're going to have to build a vision that is here for the long game. We have to rely on artists and media makers to culture shift. We have to listen. We have to really see our imaginations and our identities built within the projects that serve our communities. But also, we have to pave a way towards a progressive future where South Asians can celebrate our rich history, but also challenge internal hegemonies of caste, white supremacy, gender violence, patriarchy, all of it. So I hope today's conversation, we get to really unpack the ways in which South Asian Americans have been on both sides of history, both as oppressors, but also as people of color in the United States. And I wanted to just close with a moment of silence for Breonna Taylor. Her murderers were acquitted yesterday on the anniversary of Emmett Till's murderers that were also acquitted on that day yesterday. And it really forces us to think, if we're here for the long term to fight against oppression, but also build another world, who do we need to bring along and who do we need to center in the work? So today I fight for Breonna Taylor and all the caste oppressed people that are asking us to do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharmin. And I'm looking forward to coming back to some of the threads that you've raised in that introduction. I want to introduce now Sanjay Mishra, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Drew University. He specializes in topics of immigrant political incorporation, transnationalism, and racial and ethnic politics. His work engages with political participation of South Asian immigrants in the United States. He has also been analyzing the experience of Muslim American communities with law enforcement agencies. His award-winning book titled Desis Divided, The Political Lives of South Asian Americans was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2016 and Sage India in 2017. Sanjay, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sasha, Sunil, and I'm really excited to be a part of the panel where Sharmin is contributing to the conversation, Samip is contributing to the conversation. So it's really, really exciting. And we want to acknowledge what's happening right now, the kind of injustice that we are witnessing as we are speaking in relation to Breonna Taylor, right? Despite a long summer of protests and mobilization, the justice still fails us, right? So we have to acknowledge that. This panel and the kind of questions that Sarah and Sasha came up with, that gave me a chance to think about where do South Asians fit into the larger conversation about racial justice. And I started thinking about what was happening during this summer and how were we engaging with the question of racial justice, right? And we know that that when we look at the summer, the response to George Floyd's killing was very. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of participation. There was a lot of participation all across racial identities. So blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, everyone was participating. And even at the level of political attitude and surveys that we saw that the support to Black Lives Matter, support to and opposition to police brutality was high across all racial groups, right? And so I started thinking about where are South Asians, what are South Asians doing, where are we placed in this conversation? And I started going back into some of the conversations, some of the things that I've been observing in the last few months. And I want to talk about 2 or 3 things just to give a sense of how I'm observing and what I want people to pay attention to. And it could be a partial observation. All observations are partial observations, but I have been thinking about some of these things. So we know that when George Floyd killing happened, it really created a massive backlash, not only in the US, but across the globe, right? We saw that in South Asia, for example, in India, around the same time, there was a police killing in Tamil Nadu, Jairaj and Benning, and that led to massive mobilization, and large number of people started evoking George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and all of that, right? And so we see a transnational dimension of racial mobilization. We also saw that in Pakistan, for example, Haider Ali, who is a very well-known truck artist who painted Floyd's portrait, and that became a major topic of conversation, right? So there was a transnational dimension of political mobilization that was happening, but I want to focus on what is happening with South Asians in the US. And one example that I want to give, and it might sound maybe trivial, but I think there's something serious there, right? So I was searching for things that was happening within the community, and I came across this Zoom meeting that was organized by multiple Malayali groups in the US. So Malayalis are migrants, immigrants from Kerala in the US, right? And they are large in numbers. They are scattered all across the US. They organize a Zoom meeting with a very large attendance of people, and the issue that they were concerned about, or the theme that they were tackling in that meeting, was how do we think about George Floyd? How do we think about Black Lives Matter? How do we think about abundance of anti-Black sentiments within our community? How do we think about presence of colorism within our community? And that I observed the entire meeting, and it was attended by first generation, meaning foreign born Malayalis, as well as second generation Malayalis. Many of them are local elected officials at local level, and many of them were second generation, right? And so for me, I have been observing South Asian community for the last 10, 15 years since I started my work on my dissertation. And for me, that was a moment to seriously think about it gave me a sense that there was something happening within the community, right? So it was not that the conversation was not that we are all on the same page. The conversation was much more about interrogation, right? That how do we understand ourselves? So I think that is one moment that I want to highlight from the summer. And then I heard multiple uh, conversations happening, small groups of high school kids, the high school desi kids coming together, talking about race, etc. Right? And so I heard about that too. And the second example that I want to give is something that was organized by Muslims in the US, and there is a group called Muslim ARC, Muslim ARC, a very well-known group, and they brought together a large number of Muslims. Again, on Zoom, the world was running on Zoom, right? So at that point, so they brought a large number of Muslims together, and again on the same question, and it was very poignant because uh, the person who called police uh, on George Floyd, or the shop that called police on George Floyd, was owned by a Palestinian Muslim, right? And so it became a huge issue of conversation within Muslim community, right? That how do we think about Black Lives Matter? How do we think about Black racism, right? And so in that conversation, what I saw was a large number of Arab Americans, but at the same time, a large number of South Asian Americans, Bengalis, Pakistanis, etc. Right? And again, the conversations were along the same lines. And we know that there are a large number of South Asians and Arabs who have stores in Black majority areas across the US, right? And so they're constantly dealing with this question, right? And so there were conversation about how our mosques are segregated, how we don't interact with Black Muslims, right? And so the conversations were really, really poignant, and that suggested that uh, there was something happening at that point within the community, right? And we need to pay attention to that, right? So we know that South Asians are not known for progressive racial politics, right? And they are known for anti-Black racism. They are known for colorism. But what was happening in that moment was there was some churning taking place at a large scale within South Asian community. The last example I will give is the Bangladeshi restaurant, which was burnt in Minneapolis, right? Gandhi Mahal. It was known as an Indian restaurant owned by a Bengali from Bangladesh, and the daughter of the owner, Hafsa Islam, wrote a piece in Washington Post saying that if burning of our shop is what it takes to get justice for George Floyd, then I'm happy to be a part of that. She referred to her father, Ruhail Islam, who made this famous statement, "Let my building burn. Justice needs to be served. Put those officers in jail," right? And so it was something that really triggered a conversation within the community, right? And so I want us to kind of take all of these and think about these moments and how it's intersecting with some of the ways in which South Asians have been traditionally thinking about the question of race. Is something shifting? Is there a generational divide, right? I didn't talk about that. So there was a lot of teaching and coaxing by second generation people of their parents, right? That you need to think about this question very differently, right? And so as somebody who works on South Asians in the US and who writes on South Asians, I think I just wanted to highlight these moments, not to say that the question of racism within South Asian community is a question of past. It's very much present. It's very much defines who we are, but there is something else also going on, and we want to pay attention to that, and we want to acknowledge that. I will stop there.
Thank you, Sanjay. And this question that you brought up of how do we understand who we are is a really nice segue into our third panelist and his work. So Samip Malik is co-founder and executive director of the South Asian American Digital Archive, which for the last 12 years has worked to document, preserve, and share stories from the South Asian American community. Working at the intersection of technology and storytelling, Mallick has degrees in computer science and library and information sciences, and did graduate work in history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Prior to his work with the South Asian American Digital Archive, Mallick was the director of a Center for Digital Information in South Asia at the University of Chicago Library. Samik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conversation. Sarah and Sasha, thank you so much for the invitation. And Sanjay and Sharmin, it's so great to be with you in this space today and be in conversation with both of you. So as someone who's an archivist, who's trained as an archivist, who thinks about the past a lot, one of the things that I've often wondered about, I'm curious if others have wondered this as well, is whether we would know if we were living through a historical moment. Like, how would we know if this is a history-making moment that we're living through? And I can say unequivocally now that we are living through a history-making moment with the mobilization, the mass mobilization for racial justice, with the pandemic, which we should not forget about as well, and which with the rise of authoritarianism around the world, not just in the US, not just in India, but around the world, there's no doubt in my mind personally that we're living through a moment that is making history. And so I think that archives, archivists, historians, and others have a crucial role during these particular moments, both in highlighting the ways that past moments reflect on what is happening today, but also, of course, in ensuring that our stories from today are documented and preserved for the future, for ourselves and for future generations. And so that very much gets to the heart of why we started SADA back in 2008. We started SADA really recognizing that stories from the South Asian American community simply weren't systematically being collected and preserved by other institutions, whether they be archives or museums or others, and feeling not only were our community stories not being heard, but moreover that they were in danger of being lost entirely. And so that's the work that SADA has been doing for the last 12 years, is to collect and share stories from the South Asian American community. I want to share a quote that I often do when talking about SADA's work, because I think it really gets to the heart of why it's so critically important for us to be aware of and engaged with our own community's history. It's a quote from a scholar of archival studies named Jeanette Bastien, whose research looks at what impact it has for communities to not have access to their own history, to their own archival records. And what she says is, a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. It certainly feels like to me, and I'm certain to others as well, that we are under siege currently. And it's not just our community's histories in isolation that have been erased, but also our linkages, our interconnectedness with other communities of color historically. And particularly the very tangible and real ways in which South Asian American communities, the South Asian community in the United States, owes its very existence to the struggle against anti-Black racism and the struggle for Black liberation. It's of course within the Civil Rights era in 1965 with the passing of the 1965 Immigration Act that allowed my family, and certainly I would imagine many of yours, to come to the United States in larger numbers from South Asia and other parts of the world. And one of the stories that we've been sharing over the summer is one that I think really resonates with what we're encountering today and what Sharmin and Sanjay both talked about, thinking about the conversations within our community. And this is a story of someone named H.D. Mudgal. And I wanted to share that story with you in a little bit of detail right now. So H.D. Mudgal was a South Asian immigrant in Harlem during the late 1920s, early 1930s, during the Harlem Renaissance. And he was born in the city of Hubli in what is modern day Karnataka. And he arrived in New York City around 1920. In 1922, he was hired to work for newspapers that were mouthpieces for the Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey in his organizing work in Harlem. And by May of 1930, Mudgal had risen in the ranks and was serving as an acting managing editor, a position that he held for the next 2 years. But what Mudgal's writing often stressed was the interconnected nature of the African-American struggle and worldwide anti-imperialist movements, including in India. So there's an exchange that happens between H.D. Mudgal and another South Asian immigrant in 1930 that, like I said, has a lot of relevance and resonance with what we're thinking about and talking about today. So in 1930, a South Asian immigrant published a very vicious letter in the Chicago Defender, a Black newspaper, penned under the name K. Romala, not his real name, dismissing any possible solidarity between African Americans and South Asians. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "Too much has been written by Black newspapers, magazines, and fourth-rate writers like Du Bois about the darker races. But who in the hell wants to join the caravan with the Black ones? Our caste system in India excludes those who do not belong to the Aryan white race, and we even here exclude any Indians who live and socialize with them." So Mudgal wrote a very ferocious and scathing response to this letter. And he described his fellow Indian as, quote, out of touch and a snob and a self-hating victim of white propagandists. He said Rommel had utterly forgotten the political, social, and economical oppression that India had been subjected to under the British. So that question, the question of whose struggles South Asians in the United States should identify with, is of course one that continues today. As we're discussing today, there are many in our community who recognize the ways that our community is inextricably linked with the struggle for Black liberation and against anti-Black racism. But there are others within our community, a sizable portion of our community, I would say, in fact, that think that due to their wealth, to their religion, to their nation of origin, to their caste, that they can be exempt and that they can personally be protected. In fact, there's a recent poll by AAPI Data about the upcoming presidential election, which shows that 60% or so of South Asians support Biden in the upcoming election. But that 28%, which is 1 in 3 Indian Americans, would vote for Donald Trump in the upcoming presidential election. And so what history, I would say, has taught us is that these people are absolutely wrong. And that for us to move forward as a community in any kind of meaningful way is to commit ourselves fully, not only in solidarity with Black causes, but also in addressing anti-Blackness and casteism within our own community. And so my sincere hope for SADA, of course, is that we can play some role in that effort. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Samip, and also thank you, Sharmin and Sanjay. I wanted to start off by beginning with our first question, which takes us back to Sharmin's earlier comments around the use of the term South Asian America. And I'm really interested in hearing how each of your experiences with the term has shifted. My own relationship to the term South Asian America was rooted in the organizing of Asian American studies scholars across ethnic studies programs in the University of California system. And this was inspired by the ideas of solidarity and coalition building among Asian Americans, but also alongside Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. As I began teaching, however, I found that many of my thesis students were unfamiliar with and at times uncomfortable with identifying as South Asian American, either due to a preference identifying with regional, linguistic, religious, or caste identities, or simply because they had not encountered the term in the past. Some students did not have experience organizing with Asian American communities, nor did they feel represented in Asian Pacific Islander spaces. Others emphasized their refusal of South Asian America because of its reliance on model minority tropes that position them over and against Black and Latinx communities. And outside of this tenuous relationship with the term South Asian American, my students also emphasized the need to decenter America, American exceptionalism, American empire, and the discursive formation of the American dream in the imagination for a transnational South Asia. So with that said, my question is twofold. How has the idea of South Asian America shifted over the past several decades? And what are the limitations and possibilities of this term as we reckon with new political shifts across the subcontinent and the diaspora? And could you also speak to how the term and the idea of South Asian America has shifted in your organizing, activist, or scholarly work? I thought maybe we can begin with Samip to kind of give us a sense of the term and historically how it's been used among political organizers.
I mean, so the term South Asian American is clearly a constructed term. I don't think any of us would romanticize the term. It's not a term that I think any of us is like in love with. Personally, I'm not. It's in the name of the organization that I run, but it's still not a term that I'm in love with. And yet I think I recognize the importance in terms of political organizing for a term that brings us together and that one that recognizes both shared histories and shared futures. I think it's a term that has incredible power because of that, more so than any one connection to a nation of origin or a religious identity. It really recognizes the ways that those of us who have immigrated from parts of the world that experience colonization, have experienced other kinds of oppression, are linked together here in the United States. And I think the way that I've often thought about it as well is that, any of us can simultaneously inhabit multiple identities, right? So I live in Philadelphia. I've lived here for the last 8 years. I consider myself a Philadelphian, but I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in the Midwest, and being a Midwesterner is also very core to my identity. These are two contradictory identities in some ways, but they're also very much core to who I am. In the same way that South Asian as an identity or South Asian American as an identity doesn't have to subsume any other identity or have to override any other identity. It can just be part of a way that you identify yourself in recognition of the importance of building solidarities, building connections with others from the region of South Asia here in the United States, while also simultaneously allowing you to retain those other identities that may be important to you. But I think building on what Sharmin said, I think that's a term that also, in the effort to not romanticize, we should recognize the ways that it is a term that is homogenizing, that papers over really critically important differences within our community, differences that affect the day-to-day lives of South Asian Americans. For example, it's as undoubtedly many of us assembled here today will know that there is a particular narrative told about South Asian Americans, one of success, one of the model minority, one of high educational attainment. But that ignores the fact that there are more than 500,000 undocumented South Asians living in the United States today, that 1 in 10 of South Asian Americans lives under the poverty line. And those differences really mean something in our community. And that's not even to say, the kinds of ways that South Asian organizing has, of course, often privileged in the Indian, Hindu, middle and upper middle class perspectives. And so as an organization, I think going to the second part of your question, Sasha, one of the ways that we've tried to reckon with that, of course, is to be very intentional and purposeful in ensuring that and working proactively to ensure that non-Indian, non-Hindu voices are represented in the work that SADA does. One of those ways is through archival collecting that's directed by our organization. So partnering with organizations like DRUM and with the Indo-Caribbean Alliance and others to ensure that voices of their organizing work, of their work is reflected in SADA's work. Another is through what we call participatory storytelling projects. So projects like our First Days project, where we collect and share stories from immigrants and refugees about their very first experiences in the United States. Projects like the Road Trips project, where we collect short stories and photographs of South Asians traveling across the country. And like our most recent project, Letters from 6 Feet Away, where we collect South Asian American experiences of COVID-19. These projects basically open up the archive and allow anyone from anywhere to submit their story directly. And there's no moderation really. So anyone can submit their experiences directly to the archive, and those experiences are shared with the world. And the third, and I think this has been some of the most meaningful work for me personally to be part of, is our Archival Creators Fellowship Program. This is a program that was funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and one that allows us to not just partner with, but also financially support and fund those from groups that have been historically marginalized and silenced within the South Asian American experience to share their own community stories. So we had our first round of the fellowship last year. We had 3 fellows who I just learned so much from them and did such incredibly thoughtful and creative work in their own communities. Tanya Danki working with Dalit histories, Gayatri Bahadur working with Indo-Guyanese stories, and Mustafa Saif working with queer and trans histories. And we're just finalizing the 6 fellows for the 2021 fellowship, and have another fellowship that we'll be offering again next year. But once again, like I said, this has been for me personally, I think for the organization, some of the most meaningful work that we've been able to be engaged in, because it really does push against what most people think of as the conception of South Asian America. It really does ensure that voices that don't get heard get to not only be heard, but also to share their stories in their own words.
Thank you, Samip. And maybe now we could hear from Sanjay on this question. And Sanjay, I want to add here also the term desis, especially given the title of your book, and maybe ask you to additionally speak on the utility of that term as an organizing or descriptive vehicle.
Thanks, Sarah, for that question. So I'll talk about a couple of things. I'll talk first about South Asian, category of South Asian, and then I'll talk about the term Desi. As Samip said, that it's a constructed category, right? So it emerged in a particular kind of geopolitical context, Cold War, attempt to create area studies in the US universities, right? That was the context in which the term South Asia emerged, right? And so we have to keep that in mind, that very constructed nature, and it doesn't have a long history in the subcontinent, right? In the subcontinent, people do not have a long memory of the term South Asia, right? And people don't have that kind of identification with South Asia. But as somebody who situates South Asians in the larger context of Asian American studies, I want to say that the term South Asian as a geopolitical category and the term South Asian American or South Asians used in the context of immigrant communities have different connotations. So term South Asian in that context is a uh, deeply connected to the process of racialization, right? So South Asian is a deeply racialized category, as Asian American is a deeply racialized category, right? And so we can unpack this. We can talk more about this. What do we mean by racialized? But when we think about the term Asian American, the term Asian American itself came as a part of trying to create a space for particular kind of people who came to the US over many generations, and link that to some kind of racial identity, right? And then that gets linked to the larger history of racial meaning around the term Chinaman or Oriental or Asian, right? And so I want to be very clear about this idea that when we think about South Asian, particularly in the context of South Asian Americans, then we have to place it as a deeply racialized category, right? And so what is happening is that this term then becomes a part of an attempt to acquire some space in the larger racial space making that is happening. So one of the ways in which, and Sasha mentioned that earlier, that how do we place South Asians in the larger history of Asian Americans, right? So what we have seen in the past is that Asian American as a category did not have much space for South Asian, right? So South Asians had to really fight and create a space for what is known as South Asian, right? And so there is some amount of sort of attempt to create a space for this racial group or for this racial category that is happening. In that sense, it is a racial category, and that is an important point to keep in mind, right? And the second thing I want to say is that I want to distinguish between, and this could be a little bit more sort of political behavior kind of thing in political science. I want us to distinguish between South Asian as an identity and South Asian as a political category, right? So South Asian as identity is very distinct, meaning that, do I think of myself as South Asian? Is that my identity, right? If we talk about South Asian as identity, it's very weak, right? Uh, People do not see themselves as South Asians. People see themselves as Tamil or Indian or Punjabi or Bengali, right? And so in terms of identity, so we have to make a distinction between South Asian as an identity and South Asian as a category or a political category. And it's not very different from what is happening within the category of Asian American. So when you think about Asian American, if you ask a Korean or a Chinese person, chances are very high that, and we have data on that, right, that a level of identification with that category is very low, right? People do not identify with the category of Asian American. They identify more with Korean, Chinese, etc., right? And so so there is that sort of distinction that we need to make. And the third point that I want to make is that for progressives, particularly in the context of racial politics, for progressives, it became a very powerful tool, the category of South Asians, because it allowed them to then challenge narrow identity. It allows them to challenge more nation of origin based identity, and trying to create narratives, political spaces, archives, etc., which is uh, uh, pan-national, right? So something akin to the category of Asian American, right? That Asian American has an archive, has a historical archive, has a historical memory. South Asian doesn't have that kind of memory, right? And so for progressives, it became a tool to push certain kinds of conversations in the public arena, right? And so that is an important part of it. So I think for progressive, South Asian remains an important category, right? Samip talked about contestation. I would say just a couple of things. When I was doing my dissertation research, I would ask all the groups. I talked to Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis, and I would ask them, do you think of yourself as, what do you think about the category of South Asian? And not a lot of people were sort of very gung-ho about the category. Some of them said that it doesn't mean anything to me. But there was a very pointed critique that I came across when I talked to a couple of Bangladeshi activists in and around Jackson Heights area when I was doing my fieldwork. And they say that if we go for South Asian, then our identity just disappears, right? It's a hegemonic category, right? We will be completely taken over by Indians, right? And we do not want that to happen. So we want to have a Bangladeshi distinct identity, right? Right. And so you see some of the mobilizing that is happening right now among Bangladeshi community. It's not happening in the name of South Asian. It's happening in the name of Bangladeshi sort of identity. And so that oppressive nature of South Asian category gets revealed in that sort of critique that people are making, right? And so then that doesn't leave us more sort of, that questions the sort of how powerful is this category, right? So it's deeply contested, and we have to keep this in mind. And it's not only contested by Bangladeshi American, it's also contested by Indians now. So with the emergence of Hindu right wing, I don't know how many of you recall this hashtag campaign, Don't Erase India, right? It came in the context of California textbook controversy, right? And California textbook, they wanted to use the term South Asia to talk about Indian subcontinent, and the Hindu right wing and people who were aligned with them, they went ballistic about that. They were completely unhappy about that. And they saw the term South Asian as an attempt to erase India and turn that into something else. And that got aligned with the larger question of caste, which we'll talk about a little bit later, right? And so there is that. It's not that Indians are sitting there trying to use this category, right? There is deep contestation from that side also, right? And about the term Desi, I would say it has got some traction, right? So we have a lot of books that have title Desi, right? It's something that is part of the pot, right? And so, as Samip was saying, we have multiple identities, right? And but I mean, there is some discomfort with this category, right? So the connotation of Desi is also sort of this idea of native or rural or unsophisticated, right? So there is that connotation. Sri Lankans do not see themselves as Desi at all, right? That the term doesn't have much resonance in that community, right? And but I've seen that it's it has become a part of a larger conversation. But I don't see this as replacing sort of South Asian, and I also feel that it's more of an insider term. If somebody from outside calls you Desi, perhaps you might get offended, right? But if insiders use that term, you will think about it differently, right? So just two quick points I want to make. One is that in my own work, what I am witnessing vis-a-vis the category of South Asian is that I am witnessing much more religion becoming a central axis within these communities, right? And so from multiple sources, so post 9/11 period, Muslim identity became one of the most sort of targeted category, right? And so we see Muslim identity becoming, and even South Asians are now sort of seen as, even if you're not Muslim, you're seen as Muslim, right? And so that kind of process is also taking place. So Muslim identity in post-9/11 period, we are also seeing Sikh identity taking a very important space, right? Because of the targeting, because of certain kind of history in India, right? So a lot of mobilizing, a lot of organizing, a lot of civil rights work that is happening within the community is happening around Sikh identity. And I don't need to talk much about Hindu identity. The emergence of right-wing forces in India has given a new sort of color to Hindu identity, right? So I would say that when I started my work, I was thinking more about contestation between pan-ethnic category of South Asian and more national ethnic category of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. Now I am seeing much more this contestation of religious identity versus South Asian identity, right? And so that is something that has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. And so we have a whole bowl of identity, and we have to work with that, right? So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. And I wonder, Sharmin, if you wanted to speak to a little bit about the term as it's used among organizers and activists, and also within the context of Equality Lab, sort of how you take up that idea of South Asian American.
Yeah, I really appreciate the context setting that both Sanjay and Samip did. I'm in much agreement. And I can speak about South Asian identity and the way it shows up in our politics and our solidarity models. So much of the dominant narrative around South Asian issues, but also who gets a seat at the table, whether it be at a presidential campaign or a board chair of a prominent South Asian organization that markets itself as South Asian, ends up reifying hegemony and Indocentrism, like both Sanjay and Samip have said. What that also does is erases the caste positionality of the different South Asians in the room. And caste goes wherever South Asians go. It is a history that oftentimes dominant caste people do not want to own up to or name. So the title of South Asian benefits them because it puts them in a position of both precarity, but also I am an oppressed person in America's people of color structure, right? So the invisibilization of caste is something that we're seeing a lot in the South Asian sphere. We're also seeing even progressive spaces reckoning with questions of what is a progressive South Asian politic, right? Haymarket Books, a very popular progressive publisher. Their map of South Asia only featured India and Pakistan, actively erasing Bangladesh, Bhutan, and all the surrounding countries. And this was a progressive publisher, right? Because I grew up in Queens, I have been able to actively decenter upper caste Indian American people because my community was predominantly Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Nepali folks who did not benefit from the different types of organizing that upper caste Indians were doing at the time. Our struggles were radically different. Bangladeshi organizers I knew were fighting against deportation. They were fighting against being harassed and attacked by the New York City Police Department as street vendors. Organizers were fighting against the rise of surveillance in mosques and cultural centers. There were Muslims and South Asians who were domestic workers, and they were organizing committees to get people to fight for fair worker practices, but also against dominant caste employers and networks of power that were not only stealing passports from domestic workers, but abusing them. And in some cases, it's been as grave as murder and violence against domestic workers that has resulted in a lot of high-profile cases in the early 90s and 2000s. these organizations and organizers all organize under the umbrella of South Asia. You know, DRUM, Desis Rising Up and Moving, a very prominent South Asian working class organization, identifies as South Asian, but their base is not dominant caste networks of Indians. So for me, that model of organizing works because of the linguistic diversity, the way DRUM practices worker justice and language justice, but also the ways they center the most oppressed South Asians in their politic of solidarity. And DRUM has a very phenomenal model of transformational solidarity. So it's not solidarity that is representational. It's not solidarity that throws people under the bus to get a seat at the table. It's solidarity that actively challenges hegemony and flips the power structure to put those who are the most oppressed at the decision-making table of campaigns and different organizing efforts. I'm going to use a few examples of the way South Asian organizing has kind of, you know, reified Indocentrism, but also caste hegemony. In 1997, we saw SASC's Domestic Workers Committee. SASC is New York's leading domestic violence organization. They organized under a domestic workers committee to fight for the rights of South Asian workers that were being abused by their employers. SASC's board was and remains to be predominantly dominant caste Indian, but their base is predominantly Bangladeshi because of the levels of class and gender issues within the New York City South Asian community. A lot of Bangladeshis call for DV services. Many of these domestic worker organizers, a part of the Domestic Workers Committee, were caste oppressed Bahujans, they were refugees, they were undocumented, and they were people that were challenging the power structures that New York City was operating in at the time. This was also when, you know, our mayor was considering having Eid as a holiday that was recognized. You know, the conversations were starting about South Asian representation in New York City. When SASC's Domestic Workers Committee decided to organize against an employer that was friends with board members at SASC, SASC decided to disband and shut down the Domestic Workers Committee and locked the organizers out of the office. This story is archived by Sada. Many folks have written about it as well in their studies of South Asian history in America. And I highlight this example to show the ways that our own people throw us under the bus sometimes. That there are people within our community who have institutional power that will not always stand up for us, especially when we are challenging the power structures that they benefit from. So in this case, a lot of us assumed that this employer who was being challenged was either a donor or a friend, a family friend of the board of SASC at the time. These histories are what caste oppressed South Asians operate under. You know, we walk into South Asian spaces knowing that there are power dynamics here at hand, and that if you talk about the one issue that ruffles the feather of another person, that you will actively be silenced and marginalized. And in the Bangladeshi community, we see this happen all the time, where people who support the ruling party of the Awami League run local newspapers, they run community organizations, and they actively support abusers. They campaign on behalf of men who have stolen money from community, right? And they defend elite people within our community. These are networks of power. They are networks of influence. They are the people that we have to fight internally to even get to a multiracial coalition or a multiracial strategy space, right? And I think Howdy Modi, which happened last summer, is a really good example of that. That there are dominant caste Indian networks that are honoring Donald Trump, that are going to mobilize in the hundreds of thousands in Houston, Texas, which is also a very Muslim place. It's a very South Asian place at the same time. And they will throw our communities under the bus. And these are the people that are also organizing Republicans for Trump, Republican Hindus for Trump, right? And there's also now a Hindus for Biden, which is also forming under the same exact structures of dominant caste networks, trying to get a seat at the table. And so when I say throwing under the bus, I'm talking about the ways in which, for example, many Hindu organizations have invited the police for Raksha Bandhan at their local mandirs. There are mosques that agreed to countering violent extremism money, which is a program organized by the government to get Muslims to surveil the Muslims of our community are okay with working with government agencies. They're okay with working with the police because they believe that according to their agenda, that what they think is most important is securing a seat at the table of the American dream, despite the legacies of violence that the police department has waged upon Black Americans, Muslim Americans, and all the folks who are actively getting entrapped and surveilled by the FBI. So I think so much has changed in the past 10 years. You know, we have really phenomenal programming coming out of like leftist and progressive South Asian coalitions. So East Coast Solidarity Summer, Bay Area Solidarity Summer, Chicago Desi Youth Rising. All of these initiatives are volunteer-based political education camps that I had the privilege of attending as a young student. And I was able to learn so much about anti-Black racism, the war on terror, militarism, the ways in which our communities are actively set up to harm each other, right? And also the histories of organizations like Andolan and the ways in which South Asian Muslim leaders are positioned within the structure of American hegemony. So, you know, I think the work of Equality Labs has really been thinking about the pipeline of support that these networks of right-wing power within our homelands and home are backed by, to really think of what is the long game that South Asians need to build for that is actually grounded in a radical politic of care, right? That we actually want more funding for schools and hospitals. We do not want more funding for the police. We want the Green New Deal, right? We want Medicare for all. And these are the issues that we feel like South Asian progressives need to be at the forefront of. But instead, what we're seeing is right-wing factions of our communities with their like fascist ideologies getting they get the microphone, they get the newspaper clips, because they are the people that are backed by millions of dollars worth of support. And their relationship lies at the nexus of wealth and caste inequality. And this nationalist fervor, it's very typical of the South Asian diaspora. And so it's so important for us to draw a line in the sand with our own community members. So who are the Islamophobic family members that you have? If you're a Pakistani, how is your family talking about what Shias are going through right now, right? If you are an Afghanistani person, how do you fit into a South Asian space, knowing that your community has been impacted by the same issues that Indians and Muslims and Pakistanis are talking about? So I really think that like Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi solidarity is the way that South Asian politics need to be reimagined, because by centering those who are the most oppressed, we are able to really fight back on the right-wing networks that are co-opting our identity, they're co-opting our spaces, and they're like posturing as progressive, and they're actually not. So I really just see the last 10 years as being like a really good reality check for South Asians that, you know, 1965 to the early 2000s, we occupied the space of model minority. And now we have a really important role to play in the movement for Black lives, in fighting for better communities, but also checking our own privileges and our own internal hegemonies as the way forward.
Thank you so much, Sharmin. That was a really helpful kind of primer in thinking about sort of, as you say, the posturing of progressivism within the South Asian American community. And I wanted to kind of transition into my second question. I'm going to combine the second and third questions just for the sake of time so that we have some space for audience members to also ask questions. So I'll just be brief. I wanted to ask, how has the momentum of current organizing shifted your own thinking about caste? What has been useful from the archives, your personal experiences, and in recent memory to help us form new ways of resisting caste oppression? And relatedly, there has been a lot of buzz around Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Recently, Arjuna Padarai has written an op-ed entitled Comparing Race to Caste is an Interesting Idea, but there are crucial differences between both. And Yashika Dutt has written in Foreign Policy an article that claims that Wilkerson's book brilliantly frames racial hierarchies in the United States, but largely ignores the horrors of India's caste system. So if you don't mind, could you say a bit about the parallels between the well-documented solidarity between caste and race, for instance, the Dalit Panther movement and the shared struggle for freedom? How can we think about these overlapping histories, and how too are these histories disparate? So Sharmin, if you don't mind, we can start with you, since you sort of leave us with this conversation around caste oppression.
Yeah. Thank you. So caste is a system of social hierarchy that has been one of the oldest and most codified and most practiced forms of oppression in the world. By keeping the marginalized away from knowledge sites and knowledge production, the upper caste has been able to maintain power and control. So the work of caste oppressed people has been really to think about, how do we break the hegemony of knowledge by identifying knowledge production sites, but also reclaim these spaces and motivate folks to really challenge dominant caste networks. Both Pudarai's piece and Yashika Dutt's piece are critical in looking at where are the overlaps between caste and race, but also where does that not always fit. And for what I've learned from Thenmozhi Soundararajan is that a casteist mentality is a racist mentality. That South Asians, we actually learn our anti-Blackness from our anti-Dalitness and our anti-Indigenousness, right? Even though caste and race are distinct categories, caste divides society into units of graded inequality. And because caste is fixed by a person's birth and it sets their class, occupation, and social dignity, these markers also translate to people's experiences of racism and anti-Blackness in this country. Isabel Wilkerson's book, I feel like, does a really good job at looking at the similarities and the path forward for solidarity, because what she's arguing for is a look at the entire system, not just individual behaviors as a way to fix our racist society, but also looking at how anti-Blackness and casteism has translated, right? And in South Asia, it's translated into an obsession of fair skin, that darker skinned people, who are often caste oppressed sometimes, are denied opportunities and they're discriminated against, and that sometimes caste is racialized. Oppressed caste and indigenous people are framed as darker, and the ruling castes are light-skinned and racially, spiritually pure, right? There's like this mapping of low caste to darkness and Blackness. And this racist logic is extended then to Black people, which is why we see Bollywood's depiction of Black folks. We see the way Black migrants are treated in South Asia. We see the erasure of Sindhi communities, who are historically a really like powerful community in Pakistan. That these people are also generalized as low caste through their Blackness, right? So Apudurai's observations are correct. And there's this plethora of Dalit scholars who are writing about this. And I think some of the examples that I feel has really brought forward the way casteism plays out in the United States has actually happened in my organizing. So I know many people have heard about the Cisco case, where there is finally a lawsuit of caste oppression against these dominant caste workers that actively subjugated and violated the human rights of a Dalit worker at Cisco, right? So that case was one that is now getting traction, but the way casteism plays out is so interpersonal. You know, I remember testifying in Seattle for the country's first Citizenship Amendment Act resolution, where I was called an infiltrator and a cockroach and a termite by Indians because I was a Bangladeshi that thought Indian Muslims should not be discriminated against. They should not be denaturalized, right? And I saw the way dominant caste networks painted Bangladeshi people as the bane of their existence for like my entirety of my life, right? Amit Shah, the Home Minister of India, promised to throw my people, right? So casteism has always played a huge role in the geopolitics of Bangladeshi Americans, and more so lately because we're finally talking about it. So in 2016, just a quick anecdote, the Philadelphia South Asian Collective, which has my heart, Philadelphia is one of the most badass cities that is always organizing in solidarity with Dalit Bahujan folks. They had an accountability process with a Brahmin who said that because a Muslim used his utensils to cook meat, that he must replace the utensils that he cooked with. So this Brahmin man decided to maintain the sanctimoniousness of his Brahminism and caste oppress a Muslim person that he lived with, right? And it caused uproar because this was actually a year after the Philadelphia South Asian Collective was finally asking questions about caste. And so they called Thin Mori and myself right away and they were like, hey, we need some help. Is this caste oppression? Does this Brahmin have a right to say that his utensils must remain vegetarian only, And so because we gave them the tools and the language to talk about casteism and dogmatism of vegetarianism that is often a trait of caste privileged people, PSAC was able to hold an accountability process talking about why a Brahmin asking a poor Muslim person to do something like this was actually Brahminism and that it should not be a norm that we tolerate, And I highlight this example to show that these are the ways that we need to step in to different models of engaging with each other around issues of caste and racial equity. Hina Patel was an artist that performed at Howdy Modi in Texas. And she often wants to hold South Asians for Black Lives conversations. And so many activists decided to call her in and be like, actually, Hina, you don't get to perform for Modi and then position yourself as a leader that is in solidarity with Black folks when you yourself decided to be in solidarity with the ruling party of India, So what I would say is that the standards have changed, that we're having more critical conversations, that people are thinking beyond representation, and they're actually thinking, how does my caste positionality inform my racial solidarity work? But also, where are the points of unity that we need to organize around to build stronger communities?
Sanjay or Samip, I don't know if you want to add anything to this conversation or if we should move on to the audience questions.
So I'd suggest maybe from all of the questions that that Sasha posed, maybe Samip and then followed by Sanjay, you want to pick up on one thread or one point and highlight that, and then we can get back to some of these themes because I can see that there's questions already coming up in the chat, and I think these issues we'll be able to talk about them through the questions as well. So Samip, do you want to touch on one of these points and then we'll pass on to Sanjay?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just want to mention, I think, how important the work of Equality Labs and other Dalit-led organizations has been for us to ensure that caste is part of our everyday conversation around our community. I mean, I think, yeah, the work that they've done is fundamental to the work that Zada does today. And I wanted to just give, I thought, one example of that from South Asian American history that I think demonstrates the ways that, as Sharmin said, wherever South Asians go, caste goes as well, because I think it also demonstrates the way that we analyze and think of our own histories. And that's the story of Bhagat Singh Thind, who likely many of you are familiar with, whose case for citizenship went to the US Supreme Court in 1923. And where the US Supreme Court decided unanimously that South Asians should be barred from becoming American citizens. Thind is a figure that many in the South Asian American community celebrated and continue to celebrate today as a champion of civil rights. But I think a closer examination of that case really shows us and reveals the ways that Thind's approach to his citizenship case was one that was both racist and casteist. And so basically in making his argument, what Thind argued was that he should be allowed to become an American citizen because he was a, quote, high caste Hindu of full Indian blood, and that he actually belonged to the Caucasian race, and that he was therefore white, he was claiming, and that he should be eligible for citizenship. So I'm not going to go into the details of the case too much, but basically he thought that this would be how he would gain his American citizenship. And so basically in his argument, what he was attempting to do was use caste segregation as a way to claim racial purity. So at one point in his petition, what Thind describes how, quote, the high-class Hindu regards the Aboriginal Indian Mongoloid in the same manner as the American regards those who are Black here in the United States, speaking from a matrimonial standpoint. So in his claim to be white, Aryan, Caucasian, high caste, and high class, Thind was basically attempting to disassociate himself from categories that could be understood as non-white. So he contrasts himself with those who would be defined as Aboriginal, Mongoloid, and Black. And so, what the scholar Sucheta Manjumdar has argued, for example, is that such a claim constitutes a racist response to racism. And it was also a casteist response to racism. And so I think, like I said, a closer examination through the lens that organizations like Equality Labs and other Dalit-led organizations provide really reveals a way that caste has always been and continues to be part of the conversation. And it really is a call to action for organizations like ours and to our entire community to ensure that caste and race are intersected in ways that they should be.
Thank you so much, Samip. And that anecdote also really speaks to the point that Sanjay was bringing up earlier about this distinction between identity and category. And I think it's one that all of you have kind of touched on in different ways. Sanjay, do you want to pick up on part of Sasha's questions, and then we'll move to questions from the audience?
So I have a couple of points that I wanted to make. Maybe I'll make one and wait for the other one, and maybe make that during Q&A. So I just want to echo Samip in saying that in the last 10 to 15 years, Equality Labs and other Ambedkarite groups, they have done tremendous amount of work in sort of highlighting why caste is important when we are thinking about mobilizing South Asians, mobilizing Desis, mobilizing Indian Americans, right? And they have, if it was not for their work, the kind of visibility that we see around the question of caste would have not been there, right? So it's really tremendous amount of work, and we are all sort of grateful for that work and that kind of laser focus on the question of caste. I want to make a point about sort of the field in which I work. So I see myself as somebody who works on South Asian Americans, not too much on South Asia, but South Asian Americans, and my engagement with South Asia is only to the extent to which South Asians are connected to South Asia, right? And so when I think about the scholarship on South Asian scholarship within diaspora. And there are a handful of people who have done work in the last 15, 20 years. So you don't have a huge list of scholars. You have a handful of people who have produced handful of books and articles on South Asian diaspora, right? So scholarship is kind of starting 1980 onwards. It's a limited scholarship, but fair number of books and articles, right? And when I look at that scholarship, one thing that hit me at some point during this summer, when California Cisco controversy erupted and we started having a lot of conversation around the question of caste, I pulled out all the books that I had on South Asian diaspora, and I have most of them. Right, I pulled them out and I started looking at their index pages. And I started looking at how often does caste appear in those index pages, right? And I had a hunch, right? And I include my book also in that category, right? I had a hunch that despite such, it's limited, but it's quite rich scholarship. What I found was that there were very sporadic references to caste, and in the scholarship, caste has not been highlighted as an important category, right? And so one of the things that we know about caste in diaspora, that caste in diaspora very easily becomes invisible, right? So you have to throw light on that. You have to make it visible, right? And so activists are making it visible by doing the kind of work that they do, going to the court, doing activism. But as far as South Asian diaspora scholars are concerned, I would say when I look back at the scholarship, I see a glaring gap in the scholarship, and I'm very glad to hear about Sasha's work, that it's looking at caste, but there is a complete absence of engagement with caste in South Asian diaspora literature, and that is something for us to think about. That is something for us to engage with, and we have to really introspect, right? Why did we not consider it as an important category, right? And so that's something that I have been thinking about, and I've been talking to people about, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think my second point, maybe I'll get a chance to talk about that in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to move now into Q&A, and I know some people have been typing their questions in. So what we'll do is I'll actually call on those folks who have typed in questions. So you can just very briefly introduce yourself and state your question, and we'll collect about 3 to 4, and then take about a few minutes for the panelists to respond. And we probably won't get to all of them, but I think these are questions that we can leave with and keep talking about. And if you haven't typed your question but would like to add it to that list, just raise your hand and I'll be able to call on you to speak. So let's start with Chaitana's question. I don't actually see Chaitana in the panelists. We can go then to Salva Tharin's question. Salva, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Hi everyone, my name is Salva. I am an organizer with Subcontinental Drift Boston and a doctoral student at Boston University, and in many different respects have benefited greatly from the work of all 3 panelists. So I really thank you for your insightful and critical look on South Asian Americans today. My question is about a recent trend, or not so recent, but trend that I've seen among younger South Asian American folks, and that is a move that I see as fetishizing Blackness in order to absolve ourselves of our kind of our proximity or trends of assimilation towards whiteness. And I was wondering if you had any comments on how we can, I think Equality Labs and South are great examples of how to authentically build solidarity, but for others, how do we fight white supremacy without fetishizing Blackness or Black leaders in a way that isn't building transformative visions for liberation?
Thank you. Brandon, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I was looking forward to being sort of anonymous and just typing my question in, but since Sarah has called me out. My name is Brandon Milioti. I'm the librarian for South and Southeast Asian Studies here at Yale University. And I just wanted to ask a question about whether, Northeast Indians and the Northeast Indian diaspora community factors into this conversation. It might have been mentioned when I was sort of fluttering around the house, and so I apologize if these communities did get mentioned, but I'm sort of thinking specifically about diaspora immigrant communities from Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, which have been primarily have been located in Indianapolis or Houston and so on, so maybe a little bit outside the scope of some of your organizations, but whether there's been any connections between those groups and sort of what we might call, for lack of a better term, right, sort of mainland South Asian organizing and diaspora.
Thank you, Brandon. And then we'll take a last question from Avik Sarkar. Avik, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Avik. I'm an undergraduate at Yale. I'm studying American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies. And I also wanted to thank everyone for this amazing event. Like, I feel like I've learned so much just in this short span of this event. So thank you to the moderators and to the panelists. I'm also in Sasha's South Asians in America class, so I'm really excited to continue these conversations there. My question relates to what Sharmin was talking about at the beginning in relation to abolition. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the relationships between the abolition of caste and the abolition of whiteness and the carceral state. I guess my real question in a broader kind of sense is, how can we theorize abolition in a transnational context? And how can these kind of transnational connections help us to imagine abolition in new ways and radical ways?
Great, thank you so much. And I know that that's a lot of questions on the table, and Samip, you also have to leave at 6 and we're running out of time. So maybe I'll turn to you to very quickly maybe pick up on one or just say anything in closing before you leave us.
I'll just say thank you because it was so wonderful to see everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work and some of our thoughts. Sharmin, Sanjay, so good to see you. Sorry I can't stay longer. I just have to run for another meeting. I'm really sorry to have to go, but thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us, Samip. It's a real pleasure to have you. Sanjay, would you like to pick up just briefly on any of the questions? And you certainly don't have to feel like you have to get to all of them in closing. You're on mute, Sanjay.
So on the question of organizing or presence of people from Northeast India in diaspora, in my work, I have not looked at that group, right? And the only thing I would say is that what we are realizing more and more in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in the last 10 years, that immigration from all of South Asia has become very, very diverse, right? So earlier immigration was only confined to, let's say, Punjab was a source, Gujarat was a source, right? And so now you see immigration really, really expanding in a way and bringing in all kinds of people, right? And so that is a good reminder for us to think about these categories, right? What we come across more often in New York City and generally in the literature a little bit more is presence of Tibetan immigrants, and many of those Tibetan immigrants are from India. They're coming from India. They speak Hindi fluently. They, in many ways, they partly have that identification India, right? And with their marginality to Indian how Tibetans are situated in India, right? So we are seeing much more that population is coming up in different spots, and there is some amount of work there, some amount of attention to that, right? And so, but on Northeast, we haven't done much. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Sanjay. And then Sharmin, maybe I could ask you to give some closing thoughts and pick up on any of the strands of questions.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I can answer both of those questions together because abolition and anti-Blackness are deeply connected to really just reimagining a new world. And when I speaking to Avik's question on abolition and South Asians, when I have started to talk about the history of the police in this country and the history of colonization and slavery and genocide, many South Asians also have histories of genocide. If you ask a Bangladeshi, who are the main people in prisons back home, they will tell you that it is migrants, that it is the poor, that it is those who are deemed criminal, which often translates to poor, darker skinned folks that are like type business dealings to even get by, right? All of that is the poverty of criminalization, the criminalization of poverty. When we saw the Delhi pogroms happen earlier this year in February, we watched the Delhi police aid and abet anti-Muslim violence, right? So when I speak about abolition to my community, I speak about what has been your experience of the police, right? You'll find so many people who have been sexually assaulted or raped that will say that the police did not help me, that I went to the police to file an FIR, or I went to the police to talk about something that was stolen from me and I got ridiculed, or I didn't get the support I needed, right? And so to me, that translates to the fact that there are many South Asians that actually have a critique of systems of violence, and they have a critique of governments that suppress democracy. They have a critique of power structures that are deeply invested in militarism and policing, right? You speak to anybody about Kashmir, what that brings up to them is actually a politic of care for Kashmiris that are actually being militarized right now, right? And brutally repressed. So to me, like just talking about these issues with my father and other folks who came from, the 1971 Liberation War generation, they too have a lot of critiques about democracy in South Asia. And, I found it actually really healing to just think about like communities of care with South Asians that often felt like transformative justice was too foreign of a concept, or thinking about how we don't call the police is like, just unheard of. There are so many South Asians that are also mentally ill that can't call the police in fear of violence, right? That there are domestic violence victims that don't feel like the systems that are set up right now to protect them are actually doing what they were designed to do. So, you bring up the numbers, you bring up like, what are the types of communities that we want to build, and how can South Asians not just latch on to Black community talking points and instead actually wrestle with these concepts on a material level, then South Asians can be a part of the conversation in ways that are actually transformational. And to your question around fetishization of Blackness, I actually think for South Asians that do engage in fetishizing Black struggle, in order to change, they must be deeply committed to fighting against anti-Blackness. Because if they are not seeing their behavior as oppressive or fetishizing, they won't be able to meet you at a conversation of what does real solidarity with Black folks right now look like. So I do think there's some phenomenal writers out there that have written about, you know, digital blackface, about the way that Black issues are just used as talking points instead of fighting for better worlds, which is what the Black community is asking for right now. They're asking for actions. They're asking for us to think beyond hashtags, right? And the call to action from the Movement for Black Lives is to divest from policing, is to defund the police, is to abolish prisons, right? And to uplift the investments that are needed in Black and Indigenous communities. So for anybody who engages in fetishizing Black folks, if they're not willing to talk about the issues, you know, I feel like that's the entry point. It's like, are you willing to talk about the actions that you need to take to redesign our society? You know, some people would rather not. So I would just ask, like, what is your theory of change with these people?
Thank you all so much for being here with us. And I'll just turn over to Sasha to close things.
I just want to say this has been such a generative and rich conversation to engage with you, Sharmin, Sanjay, and also with Samip, and also to kind of create space that is collaborative and also reaching towards transformative justice. I think, Sharmin, you really left us with a really kind of wide vocabulary on how to engage with ideas of anti-Blackness and anti-caste. And I hope that we can take these forward as we continue to organize in the wake of political injustice against Breonna Taylor and also kind of anti-Blackness around the world. So thank you so much to all of you for this such a kind of incredible conversation.